Have you ever wondered why the richest nations on Earth, countries with billion-dollar militaries, cutting-edge tech, and limitless resources, seem so anxious lately? Why governments that once dictated global rules now behave like something is slipping right out of their hands? Let me tell you something strange. Their biggest worry isn't war, nukes, or political rivals. It's the world's poorer nations. Yes, countries they once ignored, underestimated, or controlled through trade and diplomacy are now shaping global reality in ways the richest nations can't predict or contain, and the signs are everywhere. You have got surveys showing that citizens in wealthy nations suffer more anxiety about their financial future than people in far poorer countries. You have got supply chains so fragile that a single disruption in a developing region can freeze industries across the West. And behind closed doors, world powers are quietly panicking over something they never expected to face. A global order where influence doesn't flow from the top down anymore. Because in this new era, a tiny nation with the right mineral, a developing country with a key shipping route, or a rising middle power with fresh alliances can shake the entire system. So why, exactly, are the world's richest nations afraid of the poor ones? And what does it reveal about the future of global power? Let's examine it in detail. If you really want to understand why the richest nations fear the poorer ones, you have to start with something that sounds completely upside down. Because when you look at the data, it turns out the world's wealthiest countries, places with the highest living standards, the strongest currencies, and the most stable governments, are also the most anxious. And not just a little anxious, clinically anxious. According to the World Mental Health Survey Consortium, countries like Australia and New Zealand report lifetime anxiety disorder rates around 8%. Now compare that to Nigeria or Shenzhen, China, where the rates drop to just 0.1% or 0.2%. That's not a small gap. That's a completely different emotional reality. And it doesn't stop there. An OECD study found that over half the people living in the richest nations worry about falling ill, being disabled, or simply not making ends meet. Imagine that living in countries with some of the highest purchasing power on the planet, yet constantly fearing financial collapse. So what's going on? Why is wealth failing to produce peace of mind? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The more interconnected and economically dominant a nation becomes, the more exposed it is to disruptions it can't control. A supply chain hiccup in a developing country, a sudden shortage of a minor resource, a political shock in a distant region, all of it can shake industries, markets, and jobs in the wealthiest nations almost instantly. And people feel that instability. They feel the fragility behind the polished surface. So while richer nations look powerful on paper, their populations are living with a constant sense that the entire system could shift overnight. And that brings us to the next big question. What exactly changed in the global economic playbook that made wealthy nations so vulnerable? To understand why wealthy nations feel exposed today, you have to look at how globalization quietly rewrote the rules they built their dominance on. For decades, the model was simple. Rich countries controlled manufacturing, shaped global trade, and secured the resources they needed. The system worked because they wrote it, managed it, and benefited the most from it. But that old playbook doesn't function the same way anymore. According to the World Economic Forum's 2025 Global Risks Report, we are now living in an increasingly fractured global landscape. That's their way of saying the world is no longer moving in one coordinated direction. Geopolitics, climate pressures, and societal tensions are now shaping economic decisions more than pure market logic. Even national security is starting to dominate government agendas, which tells you powerful nations no longer trust the stability they once relied on. And then there's the issue of supply chains. S&P Global's analysis makes it clear. After years of outsourcing and offshoring to cut costs, wealthy nations suddenly realized how dependent they had become on other countries, especially developing ones. One disruption, One political shift, one natural disaster, and industries across Europe, North America, and East Asia can stall. That vulnerability has pushed companies into strategies like friends whoring, where they only rely on politically aligned partners. It sounds smart on paper, but in reality, it shows just how anxious wealthy countries are about losing control over the very economic networks they built. The cracks in the system aren't theoretical, they are visible, they are structural, and for the first time in decades, they are forcing rich nations to admit they are not insulated from global shocks. The world they once dominated is starting to move without them, and nothing proves that shift more dramatically than the rise of new economic players who are changing the balance of power almost overnight. If you really want to see why wealthy nations are anxious, look at what's happening in places they barely paid attention to a decade ago. The global economy isn't just shifting, it's producing new power centers at a pace nobody expected. And the best example of this surge is Guyana. 10 years ago, Guyana sat at 106th place globally in GDP per capita, hovering around $11,000. It was a small, relatively quiet South American country with limited global influence. Then came one of the largest offshore oil discoveries in decades, and everything changed. Today, Guyana's GDP per capita has exploded to over $94,000, making it the 9th richest country in the world by that measure. Even more shocking, its economy has been growing at around 25% per year. That's not just growth. That's a complete rewrite of global economic rankings. And Guyana isn't an anomaly. The World Economic Forum reports that we are moving into a multipolar or fragmented order, where middle and rising powers no longer wait for traditional giants to set the rules. 64% of experts expect this fragmented order to define the next decade. It means that the world is entering a phase where influence can come from unexpected places, resource-rich nations, mineral-heavy regions, and fast-growing economies that suddenly matter to everyone. For wealthy nations, this creates a new kind of fear. They can no longer assume dominance or expect developing countries to stay developing. When smaller nations find new leverage, whether oil, lithium, or strategic geography, it reshapes alliances, trade flows, and power structures. The rise of these new players doesn't threaten wealthy nations militarily, it threatens their certainty. The hierarchy they relied on is slipping, and the economic map is being redrawn in real time. And this shifting map is feeding directly into something even bigger: a global geopolitical recession, where economic power and political conflict are becoming inseparable. As new powers rise and old assumptions collapse, wealthy nations are finding themselves pulled into a new kind of battlefield, one where control over resources, markets, and influence matters more than tanks or missiles. The World Economic Forum calls this moment a geopolitical recession, and you can see why. In just 1 year, state-based armed conflict jumped from the 8th largest global risk to the #1 concern for 2025. But the real story isn't only about conflict, it's about the economic tensions underneath it. Geoeconomics confrontation is now ranked as the 3rd biggest global risk, driven by sanctions, tariffs, and investment restrictions. These tools used to be the West's way of shaping global behavior. Now they are signs of insecurity. When wealthy nations fear losing leverage, they start weaponizing economic ties they once encouraged. At the same time, internal fractures in rich countries are widening. Inequality is identified as the most central risk in the WEF's 2025 report. And that's not just a label. When the top 10 richest countries enjoy an average purchasing power above $118,000 and the poorest struggle at $1,600, the system strains from both ends. Social polarization, involuntary migration, and erosion of human rights are all emerging as major risks. A nation divided internally becomes weaker externally, and other players know it. Then there's the energy shift. For decades, control of oil meant control of the global economy. But today, climate risk is one of the most politically polarizing issues, and countries reliant on fossil fuels are pushing back against the transition. Meanwhile, many poorer nations have the upper hand in the minerals needed for renewables, lithium, cobalt, rare earths. Suddenly, the old energy giants are no longer the only ones who matter. This is the new economic battlefield, unpredictable, multipolar, and defined by shifting dependencies. And it leaves even the wealthiest nations realizing that in an interdependent world, control is never guaranteed.